Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of I Like to Read with me, your host, Rachel Polanski. Today is a very, very special day. I am honored to be joined by Laurie Stolarz, who is the author of 17 novels. I have been reading her work since her first book came out, and it's incredibly special to be able to talk with her today. So, welcome, Laurie. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Would you like to give the listeners a little bit of an introduction for those who may not be familiar with you and your work?
Sure. So I'm the author of 18
Oh,
young adult
18, sorry.
novels. That's okay. Starting with the Blues for Nightmare series, I also have the Touch series. I did a couple standalones, Bleed Project 17, and then I did the Dark House series. Shudder. Most recently, I did Jane Anonymous and The Last Secret You'll Ever Keep. And I also wrote a book for the Amanda Project.
Awesome.
So, busy.
Yeah. So do you have a favorite and a least favorite of your work with such an impressive catalog? Is there one that you feel more partial to? I mean, I'm sure there's got to be, or do you love all of them?
I get that question quite a bit. And there's different aspects of them, that I like about each one of them. Certainly the Blues for Nightmares is really special to me because it was my first book and it kind of, paved the way to the rest of my writing. So I love one for that, but I also love, I love Dead Little Secret. I love her ability in that one. She uses psychometry, and I really love that. And I love I kind of went out on a limb with Bleed, and I really was experimental with that one. And then Jane Anonymous, I love that one. That one came out last year, and that one is just really special to me. I love, so that one tells a story of this girl named Jane who is abducted, and she's kept for 7 months. And it actually takes place after she gets back. And, when somebody goes through something traumatic, we all give them a certain amount of time to grieve and to kind of work through that. But Jane she just can't seem to get out of it. Giving you that sort of time and, you've all the of, paving your way toward healing. But what happens when you just simply, and I love that book kind of addresses that question when you're no longer the person. How can you?
Oh, hang on. I think I just lost the last what you said. The internet cut out for a second. Hang on. Let me.
Okay.
Sorry. So what was that? So you were talking about Jane Anonymous, and then the last thing cut off. What were you saying? It's hard to come back from something, and then sorry, you cut out.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, just when you've checked all the boxes in terms of healing,
right,
and people have given you that grieving time, and you think that you're doing everything right, but then what happens when you still can't move forward?
Right. And so that's actually the book that kind of brought me back to you because, like I said, I read all of your books. And then I don't know how Jane Anonymous came up for me because I read a lot. And then I was like, wait, you have a new book. And then you have the follow-up, which I admittedly have not read yet, but it is on my list. So what was it like to sort of craft this sympathetic character who's also, I mean, I won't give away any spoilers necessarily, but there is an element of an unreliable narrator aspect to it that I think is a little bit different than we see in your previous novels. So what was it like to sort of have that balance between sympathetic versus this sort of like Stockholm syndrome-esque unreliability to Jane?
Do you mean like writing a character?
Yeah. What was it like to craft? Because she is incredibly sympathetic, but you can also tell, she's been through this incredible trauma. She's been kidnapped. And like you mentioned, we start out with her we know that she is safe now,
Right.
but we're recounting what went on in that and how the trauma has affected her. So what was it like to write this character who sort of straddles those two lines?
Yeah, so I was just really, really motivated by that notion because, we hear people say all the time, oh, get over it,
Right.
move forward. And I really wanted to kind of address, what happens when you just can't.
Yeah.
And in Jane's situation, there's this scene where, after she gets back from her captivity situation, she goes back into her room and she's no longer able to identify with any of the things in there anymore.
Yeah, that was very powerful.
Because she's no longer that same person. So what happens when you're no longer that same person, but all of those things are still in your room and all of those people,
right,
they're still in your life, and they still, at some point, they want you to bounce back and be the same old Jane that you were before. And what happens when you can't do that? So not only are you a disappointment to yourself, obviously that happened, but you're also now you're a disappointment to the other people, and they're waiting around, waiting for you to snap back and go back to the person you once were. And what happens when you can't? So I was really motivated by that and by getting it right. And there were certain scenes when I wrote in there, and I was just really just motivated by that story. And there were certain scenes, and I can't say this about all of my work or all of my scenes, certainly. As a writer, some you get more right than others.
Yeah.
There are some scenes, and I was writing, I'm like, I got it. Like, I really feel like I got it. Yeah. Like her or not like her, get frustrated with her. That's all part of it. That's
exactly.
Yeah.
Have you seen this like Freeform, the new show Cruel Summer, or have you heard about it at all? Because that you may want to check that out. It's about a girl who's kidnapped for, I think, around the same time as Jane, and then she comes back to her town, and it deals with 3 years, and every episode takes place on the same day over those 3 years. So you sort of see like the during, the before, and the after.
Oh, no.
And it's a little cheesy because it's one of those like ABC Family Freeform shows, but it takes place in the 90s too. So it has like a fun nostalgic element to it. Definitely not as nuanced, I would say, as your book, but it's still definitely like a fun watch. So check out Cruel Summer. Yeah, check it out. So going back to the beginning of your career, the Blue is for Nightmare series was very influential in my life. I'm actually from Massachusetts, and so my grandparents lived in Salem for a long period of my life. So I too was obsessed with sort of like the witch trials, and more than that too, just the magic. I know how I had like a Wiccan altar, and I don't think I was like 10 or 11. I don't think I even really understood what I was doing necessarily, but just the idea of being connected to something sort of otherworldly and supernatural that wasn't necessarily like a religion, godlike thing that I had previously been exposed to. Like your series was one of the first times that I was exposed to that. So I'd love to learn a little bit more about your background growing up, and sort of how Salem and the idea of magic and supernatural influenced you and in your subsequent work, so we can go into them individually.
Mm-hmm. So I grew up in Salem, but it's interesting growing up in Salem, walking past the Witch Museum and all of these really historical monuments and amazing, amazing history in Salem. But I didn't appreciate it growing up there.
Right, because it's just in your backyard. It's there.
Yeah, I would walk home, through Gallows Hill.
Yep.
And, it was just like nothing. So Blue is for Nightmares came about because I always knew I wanted to be a writer. So my first class at Emerson College in Boston.
Yep, very familiar.
We had to go around the room. My first class for writing the young adult novel, we had to go around the room and kind of talk about what we wanted our first book to be about. And we did this free writing exercise, and I had no idea what I wanted to write about. I just knew that I wanted to write suspense. But I had this girl, I just happened to name her Stacy. I had her meditating in front of a candle, which just happened to be blue. and I was, I read the little scene aloud, and somebody in class said, "Oh, well, she has a candle, and you're originally from Salem, so why don't you just make her a witch?" I said,
Oh.
"Oh, yeah, good idea, no problem." So then I started to research what that really meant. And, another thing, going to school in Salem is no big deal to have kids in class who were practicing Wiccans or witches. Nobody really thought anything differently about it because it is a really recognized and acceptable religion, certainly here as well as, all over the world. But I never really questioned it too much until I started writing. So once I started researching for it, I did all of that research. I interviewed practicing Wiccans and witches, learned the difference between both versus those who practice folk magic. I worked at the Salem Witch Museum as part of my research. I read everything I could get my hands on with respect to witchcraft and Wicca and folk magic, and then really learned that, like you speak about the altar that you have. I mean, a lot of it, you can see how, other religions, people think, oh, witchcraft, it's so different, but it's really not. There's so much prayer and symbolism, and, they believe it's so much in, the God and the goddess aspect of it, and the spiritual aspects of it. And now even with, aromatherapy, even, things that have become more mainstream.
Crystal stores on like every other corner.
Yeah. So much more, more mainstream and everyday. And so, had a little bit of a sixth sense because she was born partially blind.
Oh.
And so, so sometimes, people will say if you don't have one of your senses, you'll develop the other ones. So she used to have premonitions, she would little snippets. So I started to ask a lot of questions in my family.
Yeah.
And and so that's how all of that came about. But I was so glad to do all of that research because Salem is fascinating.
It really is. Like you can barely scratch the surface in like five. I mean, they have so much there in terms of tourist attractions, but also in terms of just the rich history of the city and in terms of like, I mean, it's still crazy too that it's so, I mean, of course we have the Crucible as sort of like the pinnacle, quote unquote, of the Salem witch trial adaptations. But even now, I mean, every few months, I feel like something comes out that's indirectly or directly related, not just about witches, but I recently read Everyone Knows Your Mother is a Witch, which was not exactly the Salem witch trials, but related more to like the European witch trials. So there's just still like, people still love to explore. And I think that there's so many different ways you can explore them. I mean, it's not just the Salem witch trials, it's also just witch trials in general were a huge thing.
Yes. And then also learning as an adult, how much it spanned into the surrounding community.
Yeah.
Rated Danvers more, and just, more, like you said, the rich history of the surrounding.
Right, because it's more than just Salem proper. I mean, yeah, you're right. It was Danvers and all those surrounding like North Shore areas. Yeah, and then having my grandparents live there was just an added bonus. I think anyone in Massachusetts kind of feels like a small affinity, but especially if you have some sort of family that goes there. So yeah, it's like, oh, we're going out to dinner, and we're also just passing the Salem Witch Museum. Right. And we're passing not only the Witch Museum, which is cheesy and do they still have those like the show that it lights up and goes on like the diagram and the voices in the background. Yeah. But I found it, it's interesting too, because it makes it very like approachable and storytelling like for a young audience. So I think it draws you in at a young age. And then of course, if you're really interested in it, the older you get and the more you mature, like the more that you can find the darkness and sort of the stuff that they don't tell you when you're like 10 years old.
Right. And I love how it's pretty accepted. Are you frozen? Okay.
Oh no, you were frozen. That's
okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. It's the beauties of technology, right?
I know. I was saying, I love how, it is the religion is becoming just more widely.
Yeah.
People are seeing that, the way it has been depicted in TV, on the media, it's just not accurate at all. Witchcraft really has nothing to do with evil or anything
Yeah.
like that.
So your book kind of came out, I mean, a little bit after like Charmed. And I think that there was a lot, I feel like Stacey is kind of a mix of like what would happen if the universe of Charmed, which is obvious, Charmed, and also like The Craft and that kind of stuff, sort of combined with like Nancy Drew and that more realistic, like girl solving problems thing. What other inspirations for Stacey beyond how else who else blended to help make her who she is?
Yeah, I definitely didn't want her to do any kind of hocus pocus kind of
Yeah, that, or
things.
what is
I
it,
wanted it to
Halloween?
be
Yeah,
more.
Hocus Pocus, like Sarah Jessica. Like, I don't like that. I mean, I know that people love that movie and it's like a classic Salem movie, but I do find that one like a little too hokey for me sometimes. It's fun, but it's
Yeah, yeah.
And so what made you want to, keep it in more of the young adult universe? Where did the decision to keep it and keep your further books in the young adult universe? Where did that come from? And also if you can speak a little bit about sort of the stigma that sometimes come with young adults and sort of, people think, oh, if I'm above 15, I can't read this. And I often disagree and find that young adult is just a diverse range of books as any other books. But if you can talk a little bit about some sort of stereotypes or problems, adversarial things that you've had to overcome by sticking to the young adult realm.
Okay, so I wanted to write for young adults just because, well, for one, I think that just being in that young adult world, there's so much that goes on those ages. I mean, it's such a time of just heightened drama, and there's so many firsts going on. It's just a really great opportunity, I think, for a writer.
Yeah.
To be in that world. And then, yeah. And I don't, like you're saying, I don't think, I think that a lot of adults are reading young adult material now too. I don't think it's just young adults, but I've seen a lot of changes in the young adult literature just since 2003 is when Blue is for Nightmares came out. It's changed so much. I mean, it's opened way up. And then, we've had, lower YA, upper YA, we've had crossover YA, we've had different categories of YA and what is YA, what makes a crossover, what makes middle grade. And I think that the lines are, particularly now, I feel like they're getting more and more blurred.
Yeah.
As you're saying that some people feel like, if you're above 15, what should you be reading? Should you just gravitate toward the adult books? But I feel like now young adult books are really more adult.
Yeah, they're a lot more. I mean, at least the ones that I've read that have come out recently. I mean, I think I stuck away from it. There was a period where I was reading so much of it, but it almost got to the point where it was like so formulaic. There wasn't really much, it was sort of the writing style was a little bit lacking. And I think it was sort of intended to be for younger readers. Whereas now I think we're dealing with just as mature topics where I think the characters are a lot more three-dimensional and they're designed to sort of provoke different feelings for adults and children. They're not just written with 15-year-olds in mind, but they're written with the 30-year-olds who were 15-year-olds in mind as well.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And what was it like to sort of end the saga? So there's 4 books in the saga, and then there's a 5th graphic novel in the Blue is for Nightmare series, right? Oh, did you freeze for a second? We need a spell to cast on the Wi-Fi. There we go. As I say, we need a spell to be like, excuse, please, can we just have good Wi-Fi for the next 20 minutes? What did I even just say? I don't remember. Oh, right. Yeah. The graphic novel. Yeah. So I think I read it and I remember really liking it. And I thought it was a fun change and a cool way to end the saga. But if you can talk a little bit more about, because that was your first and only graphic novel so far. So why the decision to end, not just write a graphic novel, but also the decision to end the 4-part, now 5-part saga with the graphic novel?
So that was not my idea. I
Oh.
finished Project 17, the Bleed Project 17, the 2-book duology. So I was onto the Touch book, and my publisher, the Blues for Nightmares, asked me if I would consider doing a graphic novel. And I loved the idea. I mean, I love graphic novels. I think they're really, really, really fun. And I started when I was, started writing. So I wrote Black is for Beginnings in screenplay form.
Oh, cool.
Which was really cool to be able to picture it, in scene like that.
Yeah.
And to write it in that format. It was really a fun, it was a fun project for me to work on. And then being able to, for the first time ever, was a thrill, because I would be able to say, I want this sidebar, this graphic to look like this, and the illustrator would create it. It was just amazing. It was such a great opportunity. I loved it. Yeah, I would definitely do another one if given the opportunity.
So they were the ones who kind of pushed for it, and then you just kind of went along with it, and were like, okay,
yeah. I never even thought of it.
They were really big for a while. I think, with the way speaking of how the young adult universe has shifted, I do remember there was like a few years where it was like everyone was putting out graphic novels that, not just for comic book readers, like they're for the people who like novels and they're pushing them in a different direction. Can you talk a little bit more about more of just a general question? The supernatural versus the human evils that are present in your books. What when you first come up with the idea for a book, does the evils and the sort of antagonist, is that the first thing you think of, or how does the sort of the universes that you create in each book or each series, how do those ideas take shape?
Do you mean just with the
No, just with any of it, because I think, some of, Jane Anonymous is clearly like a much more human evil. The Blue is for Nightmares. There's a little bit of both. I want to talk about Project 17 in a minute, because I'm also familiar with the Danvers Asylum and Passy on the Highway. So we'll get into that in a second. But just the decision, some of them are much more like Welcome to the Dark House is much more human evil. So, you get a pretty good shift of both. So how do you decide which direction to go in? And then how does that shape the rest of the novel?
So I think of the antagonist or the evil per se to be mostly human. I think in most of my stories, I do dabble in, as you say, some of the supernatural, like with ghosts, but I never like to prescribe. I don't want the reader to come away and say, oh, ghosts exist. Or don't exist.
Yeah, there's a really cool balance and specter.
Yeah, and I just with all of my stories, I like to raise questions and explore questions, but I don't want to provide an answer.
Yes.
Really. So like I was saying, with the antagonist, I see it as mostly human.
And does that come from sort of like your own imagination? Is any of that, are you a fan of true crime and sort of that boon were you ahead of the game in that sense, and sort of looking at the psychology of evil and sort of what makes a person evil and how their behaviors can impact others?
Yeah, so I do a lot of research on that. I am a fan of true crime. And I do love, love, love psychology. So, with every antagonist, I mean, are they a true monster? Is there anything redeemable? So I don't think so in a lot of cases. So I do like to explore the psychology of what happened. Is it nature? Is it nurture? Is it both? Like, how did that happen and why?
Yeah, I think the how and the why, it's also like we can see how they got there, but it's like what impacted them along the way. And sometimes it's just one little thing. And I think it's a really good point that you bring up about not providing answers. And I think that's my problem with a lot of young adult fiction, at least in the past, is I do feel like everything was really presented to you. And I don't want to, I'm not going to mention any names, I'm not going to say anything specific, but a lot of it, like I said, was formulaic and it didn't leave you with many questions. It's definitely an escape. And I think all literature is an escape in one way or another, but the ones that really stick with you are the ones that make you ask these questions and really make you think. And they don't just leave everything tied up in a nice bow, whether or not that means, there's another book coming and that's intentional, or if it just sort of, I think a lot of people, they complain about cliffhanger endings or unsatisfactory endings, but I do think there's a difference. I don't know if you want to speak on a little bit about how you form your endings. I think there's a difference between sort of an unsatisfactory inconclusive ending versus an ending that is satisfactory and conclusive while still leaving room to question and leave room for more interpretation.
Yeah, I mean, endings are tough, but I always, when I start a book, I focus a lot on, what's unfolding here, with the character and why. So I like to really start with that, the character
Mhm.
and whatever they're going through. But I always have an eye on the ending. And so I always have kind of like, a vague notion of
Yeah,
especially if there is an antagonist that, the whodunit part of it,
right.
I have a pretty good idea, but you don't know how exactly, at least I don't,
Mm.
how exactly is that going to unfold. I'm not a big fan of tying things up in a neat little bow. I like questions.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, did I lose you for a second again? Oh, there we go.
I'm here.
Okay, great. So I'm in Los Angeles, so the cross country Wi-Fi might be like, no, we're not doing it today.
Oh, okay.
But I grew up, like I said, I grew up in Boston, so especially the Danvers Asylum. I too am fascinated with psychology, and I remember from a young age being because McLean Hospital, which is still an active mental health hospital, is right in my hometown. So I kind of grew up with the specter of sort of like the mental health component, and I was always interested in, especially the history of asylums and the history of how we've treated people with mental health. And then I remember whenever we would pass the Danvers asylum, it was sort of just like this looming figure on the highway. And I think now they've turned it into like
Mhm.
condos or something. But if you can, so Project 17, I mean, like I said, I love all of your books, but that one really was so cool because I think that was one of the first books that I read. I mean, now there's like American Horror Story Asylum, there's a lot of different asylum stuff, but yours was one of the first young adult ones to kind of take this contemporary notion of like exploring these abandoned facilities and connecting the past to the present. So, how did that one come about? And if you can talk a little bit more about your research for that too, I would love to learn a little bit.
Sure. So that one came about. So I sold Bleed
Mhm.
in a 2 book deal. And so when you sell something in a 2 or 3 book deal, you don't necessarily have written those other books. So I had only written Bleed. And my plan was to take one of the other Bleed characters, the
Mm.
Sadie character, and give her her own novel. And so I had my editor at the time, they felt like, well, maybe you should take it in this direction. And we just didn't see eye to eye on where it was going. I had to come up with a new idea. So the newspapers were, at the time, were tear down of Danvers State
Right, right.
because it was considered and is considered a historical landmark. So I just pitched the idea, you know, how about we have this group of teens who break into this abandoned mental institution that's rumored to be haunted on the eve of the demolition to film a documentary. And my editor said, yes, great, let's do that. I started to do the research, kind of like when myself to research, I really get into it. Like I was saying, when I worked at the Salem Witch Museum for Blue is for Nightmares, when I connected with a group of urban explorers who make it their mission to break into abandoned places. So I had to figure out how you would actually break in there and do that. Also, I interviewed former janitorial staff, former nursing staff of Danvers State. I also interviewed a neighbor of Danvers State, somebody who lived,
that's really cool.
in a residence.
Those kinds of people are always fascinating too, because it's literally just like in your own backyard, and you live your own normal life, and the crazy stuff that's happening in this building, like right behind you, is like unimaginable.
Exactly. Yes. I also read a diary of somebody who was a patient there.
So that must have been really
hours and hours of footage from this one explorer who go in there, as well as other explorers. But this one guy, it was so special to him. He said he would know if a soda can was tipped onto its side from one visit to another. That's how often he went in. Yeah.
That's crazy.
And I became so haunted by what I was reaching.
Right, because it's a real life place, and these are real people's stories. And even though your characters are fictional, they are treading it's a hallowed ground. It's a very spooky situation, even fictional or non-fictional.
Right. So I became so haunted that I didn't want to write the book anymore.
Oh,
and
wow.
I was sleeping. So I went down to my office. It was like 3 a.m. and I typed up the synopsis for a completely different novel, not related at all. And I sent it to my editor. And when she got to her office in New York a few hours later, 5 hours later, whatever it was, she's like, yeah, no, this isn't a story. We want that Danvers State story.
Once you presented that, it was probably hard to take that back. It's like you put it out there and now they want it.
Yeah. So for better, for worse, I was and only really a tip of the iceberg is in 17. So I was just so grim. I was able to write the book, and now I'm glad I did, because I think it tells an important story.
Yeah, so so many of your books feature real life places, and they're all for their own. They're inspired maybe by real life events that have happened in some way or another, but they're mostly fictional stories. And to have it again like take place in this actual place where you have the history, and it's like the haunt, are ghosts real? Who knows? But clearly there's the energy and the idea of what happened there, more than just, oh, there's a beheaded patient floating in the back. I think that's what's scarier too, is just sort of the feeling and the hauntedness. And clearly that permeated into your consciousness, because you were I'm glad you did end up finishing this book, because like I said, it's one of my favorites. And I think you're right. It's an important historical piece too, because now that it's been torn down and turned into like condos or apartments or whatever, like it's a big piece of our history in Massachusetts and just for the mental health movement in general. So I think it's, hopefully people will look at it not just as a novel, but also a historical piece of information as well. And then
they ended up preserving the Kirkbride, the front of it. So if you go up there, if you're ever back in this area,
I try to
go up there and you can see the.
Yeah, I haven't been back since. Okay, so the gate is still there that they have.
The front of the Kirkbride building.
Okay,
they preserved it.
That's nice. Okay, so they at least have a little bit of the history still there. Yeah, I'll try to get back there. I mean, I haven't been back to Boston since 2019, but now that the world is finally opening up and sort of back to normal, I just forced my parents to come here instead. My family, they all still live in Massachusetts, but I like to force them to come here instead of going back there.
Nice.
Yeah.
You
So
in LA? Are you in
yeah,
LA?
I'm in LA. I've been here for 5 years. I went to University of Vermont, so I lived in Burlington for 4 years, and
Okay.
then I was like, I'm done. It was way too small. I needed something more exciting, and now I'm in this city.
Do you like it?
I do. I mean, I originally moved here thinking I wanted to be a screenwriter, of course. Very quickly gave up that. I enjoyed writing for fun, but the idea of just like all these people wanted it so badly and I didn't want it badly enough.
Yeah.
And I think I realized that, and I was like, you know what, there's no point in putting myself through all of this rejection and like forcing myself to do all of this when it's not something I'm interested in. So like I enjoy being around pop culture and being around, there's always movie screening or, in pre-COVID times, and now it's getting back to normal. But I just sort of stay out of that as much as I can. Like right now I actually do like online event production as my full-time job. So that, that pays my bills, and then I'm able to read and talk to authors and enjoy
Right.
the literature world in my hobby time. So if you could talk a little bit, I have just a couple more questions about the Welcome to the Dark House trilogy. And Ivy, I think, is a really cool sort of like final girl. You know, add her to the final girl canonical sort of canon. And a different, you have a lot of different strong female protagonists, but I think especially Ivy in Welcome to the Dark House trilogy, just because that is definitely, I think, one of your more traditional like slasher horror type novels. Is not that they are not all filled with death and fun stuff like that, but if she definitely gave me a strong final girl vibe. So if you want to talk a little bit about your experience and love, like I personally love horror films, and I have read about the final girl and the men, women, and chainsaws, and I studied film at school, but from a theory perspective. So that's always been super fun for me to think about. So if you want to talk a little bit about if you had any inspiration from horror films or horror in your life that you took to the Welcome to the Dark House trilogy.
Yeah. So I had pitched a different story. So kind of like with Project 17, I had not intended on writing that either.
That's how the best things come up. The things that you don't intend to do, sometimes those are the best. Those are the best
Yeah.
ones.
Yeah. So I had pitched more like a Jane Anonymous to this particular editor. And he said, yeah, it's good. I just feel like the whole abduction thing is kind of already been played out. And so, like kind of with the other story I was telling you about, the Sadie story from Bleed, when you just don't have that agreement, that's okay. If you can't come to a mutual idea, I wanted to retain the Jane Anonymous story for somebody else who would be excited about it. So anyway, because I write all this creepy stuff, a lot of people do ask me, oh, do you have a lot of nightmares? And I really don't. I typically don't remember what I dream, but I did have one. And so when the abduction story didn't work out for this editor, I just pitched my nightmare.
Oh.
Yes. So my nightmare was that this, famed writer, screenwriter, director, producer, kind of like a Wes Craven.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what that's what it made me think of from the beginning. Definitely a Wes Craven type.
Yeah, I imagine that. So he had this contest where you could see his new work, but then when you go to the screening, it wasn't a screening at all. It was all a hoax that you have to get out of,
And this was all in your nightmare?
This was in my nightmare. The whole you submit your nightmare thing, I brought that in my conscious world.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, what's your biggest nightmare if you were in the Welcome to the Fear House? What would be the thing? I think about this too sometimes. I'm like, what would be the worst situation for me? Because there's a few things I'm really scared of, but I don't know what would be like the ultimate one.
I know, it's horrifying. And then you see people go on that reality show. What is it where they get like snakes? They get like,
is that Fear Factor or?
Yes, I know.
I'm like, I can't even. I love horror, but something about this like bugs and the body stuff, like No, that creeps me. Yeah, I think a pile of snakes might be one of my top fears too. I also like weirdly, I am disgusted by tuna fish. So I think if someone was like, you have to go in this
Oh,
pool of canned tuna fish, that might be one of the disgust. I'd rather be in like blood than tuna fish.
can you watch people eat it?
No, I can't even like smell. I mean, yes, if I have to, because of course, if I'm like out somewhere in public and someone's eating a tuna fish sandwich, I'm not going to like
Yeah.
run away. But when I was younger, like if my parents were making it, I would have to go upstairs. Fortunately, my boyfriend doesn't like it either. We both agree that it's like one of the worst smells in the entire world. But that's probably, I got to say, actually, that might be one of my biggest nightmares is if someone was like, you have to go into this bath full of tuna fish, and then we get, I'm getting freaked out thinking about it.
You definitely don't have a cat.
I do have a cat. Oh yeah. I love
food,
my cat.
feel
I know.
like,
Well, I give him pretty much dry food. But then the wet food, I put it in the thing and I walk away. But it's even that is not as bad as tuna fish because I give him like the chicken or the turkey wet food. I will not do the seafood ones because they're too they're too similar. Yeah, no, that's the one. Yeah, I won't give him a can of tuna fish. He's never gonna get that though.
yeah. So I pitched my nightmare, like a kind of like a real world. Do you remember that show?
Yeah. Real like I feel like there's multiple shows though where it's like they ask or shows or like real life something where they ask you your biggest fear and they don't even do it in they do it in like a sneaky way. They'll like collect information on you.
Yes.
And then yes, there's that. That was a thing for a while.
Yeah.
Because there's the psychology of it too, is it's not just something, everyone's scared of the dark or clowns. It's like what specifically for that person is the most scary. And that's what's so cool about it.
Exactly. Yes. And that makes it truly horrifying. And
Truly, because for some people it's like spiders are no big deal. And for other people, it's like, or for most people, I'm sure tuna fish is not a big deal. For me, it's like literally my nightmare.
Yes. Yes.
So are you a big like horror fan, or did this more just sort of come from your own subconscious?
I like the idea of it. I'm not, so even with Welcome to the Dark House, some people read it and were like, oh my God, that was the scariest book ever. And then some people were like, how come there wasn't more slasher blood, So I don't like all of that aspect. I don't like the blood and gore kind of aspect. I like suspense. I like the thrill of horror, but I don't like all of that, slasher kind of thing.
Yeah, I think I love horror and there's so many different genres of it, but I think the psychological horror is always what scares me the most. Like you could have a crazy person, Michael Myers or Texas. I view those as the slasher films as like fun, as messed, and I view pretty much all horror as fun because I'm just twisted that way. But something even like Shutter Island, which speaking of like Massachusetts mental health, was filmed somewhere in Massachusetts, right? Or it takes place in Massachusetts.
I think it was, yeah.
And that one always for not knowing who you are and like the idea of identity and question, and that's always what freaks me out more than anything. And I think that's what's really cool about your books too, is because you take these sort of it could be supernatural or it could be something unexplainable, but it's really, you said most of the time it's the humanness, and that's what's so scary is it's like it just could be your neighbor and you never know that. You never know. And with
that comes when you have that kind of imagination, like what if it is the neighbor? You're always looking over your shoulder.
I know it's a really weird combination because like I am always listening to true crime podcasts. Like if I'm about to fall asleep, I'll just put on just a quick little serial killer thing, and I like it soothes me for some reason. I don't know what it is. And there are a few cases like that really just like get me and keep me at like, there's this one case, I don't remember their names, but this husband and wife, they went on a boat with this group of friends because they were selling they were selling the boat to them, and the friends wanted their money and the boat. So they drugged them, they tied them to an anchor and dropped the anchor in the middle of the ocean while they were still like somewhat conscious, and they just like drowned tied together to this anchor in the middle of nowhere. Horrifying. And then an even bigger twist, it turns out the main person responsible for it is transgender, and supposedly their main motivation is they wanted money for transgender reassignment surgery, and they were able to get that in jail. So it was almost like they did it just to be able to. Really crazy. So that one, I'm like, what kind of depraved, like, thinking about just being alive. Like, I mean, I don't often think about actually being murdered, but I think the idea of like, if I had to go, being tied up, still conscious in the middle of the ocean, it's like, who could do that to someone? That kind of stuff is, but meanwhile, if I listen to a podcast about it, I'm like, it really, it's just, it's for, it makes you more aware, and it makes you, so if that sort of situation were to happen, I'm almost like, well, another one of my podcasts, and I actually learned some stuff from it. So maybe, who knows? Are you a podcast listener of true crime, or how do you consume your true crime stuff?
So I watch a lot of TV true crime, but I love Crime Junkie.
Ashley Flowers, classic. Yes. She has a whole bunch of different podcasts. She started with
Yeah. I wrote a couple stories.
Oh, that's really cool. Is that a podcast one? Or that? Yeah, that's audio chapters for networks. That's right. Yeah. That's so cool. Wow, very cool. Yeah. So do you have any true crime cases that are, your favorite, or ones that really creep you out more than anything?
I mean, I don't like it when they
the West Memphis 3, that one really always sticks with me. Is so sad, because not only did the 3 boys get murdered, but also the 3 boys who were wrongfully convicted and their lives are ruined too. Are you familiar with this case? Oh my God. Okay. There's a 3-part documentary on HBO called like Robin, the Lost Boys of some. So it's in the 90s or, early 90s, I think. 3 boys were murdered, and then these 3 boys were wrongfully convicted. And so they do eventually get out, but they were in jail for like 20 years. There was this whole movement to get them exonerated. It's really, and now they all, like 2 of the 3, like fight for wrongful convictions and injustice. And it's really fascinating, because the way that the Satanic Panic influenced them, because they were just sort of like these outcasts in this West Memphis, Arkansas or Tennessee or something. That one's really fascinating too, because even though we know what happens, and we don't know the actual killers, but we know that they're out of jail, but it's why did this happen, and how did they get there, and how do people, one wrong decision and one wrong perception, and that can change everything. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join me. I have learned so much more about, I can't believe, this is just a real crazy moment for me, because like I said, you said your first book came out in 2003. And I think I was the kind of person reading them in like 4th grade, because I was always reading a little bit above my level, but I still read them. And reading Jane Anonymous a few weeks ago is what brought me back to you. And now I have to read the sequel. But thank you for joining. And I'm sure that there will be more to come from you. And we will link your website below so everyone can check out your vast catalog of works. And until next time, everyone, stay reading. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.